But thank you enormously for the chance to come talk about what I'm sure you're so excited to come out for on a Saturday morning in a beautiful day in New York City to talk about death. But we will do it anyway. And I'm going to start by telling you about a patient that I saw in the emergency room a few years ago, and she's stuck in my mind. She was 86 years old. She had come in with a severe abdominal pain that had been radiating straight through into her back. She, when I saw her, she pointed right below her rib cage in the center, and when I pressed, I could feel this throbbing, pulsing mass. A month before, she had been diagnosed with an abdominal aortic aneurysm. An aneurysm is a ballooning of your aorta to the point that, like a balloon that's been stretched too far, it can rupture. And pressing there and finding that it was tender and painful set the alarm bells going off in my head, and I realized that she was rupturing. She was in the midst of a fatal problem. We got some swift imaging that confirmed that the aneurysm seemed to have signs of blood coming out of the aorta. Brought the vascular surgeon in, who agreed that this was someone who needed to go immediately to the operating room. I sat with her and explained what the situation was. She had a problem that could be fixed surgically, but this was no walk in the park. To repair an abdominal aortic aneurysm, you have to go in and remove open up the aneurysm that's there, put in an artificial new aorta. And in order to do that, several things have to happen. First of all, you have a 25% chance that they'll just die from bleeding or complications when you're in the midst of a problem like this. Second of all, her aneurysm included the section of the aorta that sends blood to the kidneys, and so we would have to unplug her kidneys and then sew it into the artificial graft that we would put in place. That meant that the kidneys would be offline from oxygen and blood supply for 30 to 45 minutes, and that added another, maybe we were guessing a little bit here, 25% chance that she would be on permanent dialysis. If all went well, she would spend a significant amount of time in the intensive care unit, not have those problems, and spend probably a month or two in a skilled nursing facility in rehabilitation. When I asked her a little bit about herself, she lives in Cambridge. She lived on her own in her own apartment. She did her own shopping, cooking. She took care of herself, and she really valued that independence. And I had to tell her that I thought the likelihood that she would be able to return home to that life again were almost none. But, I said, the alternative was a nearly 100% chance of death. So what would you like to do? She said she'd like to think about it. I gave her 15 minutes. She was there with her son, and I shut the double doors behind them. And then when I came back, she said she did not want the operation. She'd lived a long life, she said. She was already counting her days in coffee spoons. She'd made out her will. And so I did something I had never done before. I wrote out a prescription for pain medication for someone with a life-threatening problem, handed it to her son, and then watched her walk out of that emergency room on the arm of her son. I kept her son's phone number to follow up with him, and about 2 or 3 weeks later, I gave him a call just to see how he had weathered the aftermath. And she answered the phone. I sort of stammered, hello, how are you? Just fine, thank you, doctor. How are you? I kept up with her for another year after that, and she was just fine, living in that apartment in Cambridge, never having been worse for the wearer. The difficulties with understanding what is happening to people as they face life-threatening problems are tremendous. And we come up against our ignorance, our inability to predict very well, time and time again. And it colors a lot of the ways in which we think about taking care of people, the ways we spend our money in the healthcare system, and think a lot also about our ability as clinicians to have control over things that we sometimes really don't have control over. And what struck me, and has struck me over and over again as time has gone on in my training, I joined the faculty of our hospital about 7 years ago after going through about 8 years of training in surgery, and I've been really lucky to have gotten to be writing for the New Yorker along the way as I've gone through this process. And it's given me a vantage point from which to just puzzle over what we're really learning to do, what we have power over, and what we really don't have power over. And I've all along had this one theme of trying to struggle with how we deal with our ignorance about the end of life as clinicians and as patients. That story about the patient with the AAA repair, the AAA that I thought was rupturing, was one I wrote about in one of my earliest articles for the New Yorker. And when I've looked back on it, I've realized I've been puzzling all along the way with how we cope with these situations. In my second book, I told the story of one of my wife's cousins up in New Hampshire who gave us a call about his daughter. And the story was one that I was, again, in that effort to write about it, trying to grapple with how should we think about giving answers in a situation that's very common but pretty stark, because in this case, he was dealing with a life-threatening issue in his 12-year-old girl. Callie had been diagnosed a year before after developing some shortness of breath. She went to see her pediatrician. The pediatrician got a chest x-ray, and it showed she had a large mass in her left chest. Eventually, it was diagnosed to be a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Now, lymphomas are highly treatable, one of the most common cancers of childhood. Over 85% can be cured. And she underwent the standard chemotherapy and radiation. It's tough. 6 months of nausea, in and out of illness. She had difficulties tolerating some of the medications, but she got through, and that tumor just completely melted away. It's stunning what we've accomplished during this time. Half a century ago, there's virtually nothing we could do for a girl like her. But I said it was 85% who are cured, and she was in the 15% where the tumor came back. It was about 7 months later, and it was just as big as before. So they now tried a different chemotherapy, and this one had virtually no effect except to make her again extremely nauseated, and then dropped her white cell count, her basic immune fighting cells, to such low levels that she started to develop some life-threatening infections, fungus, other problems that put her in the hospital for weeks where she was not able to leave. And then they tried a third chemotherapy when that one wasn't working and it became intolerable. And it too did little more than lower her ability to fight off infection. And so now it became months where she just never was able to leave the hospital. She was weakened and emaciated. And that was when my wife Kathleen's cousin called and asked me, what should he do? They were offering the possibility of doing a bone marrow transplantation. And what he didn't know is whether he should be putting her through all of this for the sake of a small chance that she could survive this. The textbooks don't even tell you the statistics at this point. They just say the prognosis is poor. And what struck me was that here she was. At this point, the mass was causing so much pressure in her chest that it was causing fluid to build up, and in order to just breathe well, she had chest tubes in her chest. She had anti-nausea medication, no hair. She'd been a year away from having friends and seeing people. She was exhausted, she was emaciated, and there wasn't really an hour that went by where she wasn't in pain in one way or another and needing pain medication. But there was an option left. Do you want to do something like a bone marrow transplantation? And what struck me was I had no answer for him. No real way to even understand how to guide him. And we finished that phone conversation with me feeling like I'd been of little use, utterly unhelpful. About a week later, they sent out an email. Her mother, Shelley, sent it out to the family. And she said, she quoted at the beginning, "We must eradicate from the soul all fear and terror of what comes to us out of the future." And that day she said she was bringing Callie home. They decided not to do the bone marrow transplantation. 10 days later, they sent another email on Monday morning. Callie died peacefully at home shortly after 1 a.m. Easter Monday. We all are fine. Our home is filled with incredible peace. It's appalling to me how bad we are in the medical profession at these situations, that we haven't learned ways to handle what happens to all of us, that we all come to an end. It's cast as a financing issue. 25% of Medicare dollars are spent in the 5% of elderly patients who are in the last year of life. And the majority of those dollars are spent in the final couple months of life when there's no sign that they're actually providing great benefit. But it's actually a much deeper issue than just the dollars kinds of questions. It's an issue that gets to a puzzle of what it is that we really want, what it is that we see as being the way we want our lives to go when we come to that end. I had a patient that I wrote about in my effort to then come back again and try to tackle this issue more recently. And she was simply one of many patients where I felt like I could see the train coming. It just was a particularly dramatic case. Sarah Monopoly was 34 years old. She was in her 39th week of pregnancy when we diagnosed in her that she had a mass in her left chest that proved to be a metastatic lung cancer, and that this was a condition from which she was going to die. One puzzle people asked me, this is an article I wrote last month for the New Yorker, was why I would choose someone who's young. Why not one of the older, more typical patients, since most of us don't die young? And I think the reason why was because trying to answer this question in someone who's young seems all that much harder. You want to do everything you can to find a cure for her, find a way that she can live a long life and become that geriatric patient. But we knew we had no obvious cure. The train that was coming was she was diagnosed in July. She was started on chemotherapy, a standard chemotherapy. She had a bad adverse reaction to it, couldn't tolerate it, got started on a second cycle of chemotherapy, and made her way through the summer with it, but with no real sign that it was making any headway against her disease. And the troubling puzzle to me was that we could see that there would come a point where we'd come to an end, but none of us were yet ready to really grapple with it. As I walked through our intensive care unit, being asked to see patients for surgical consultation, I'm struck again and again how many of the patients are people that I'm being asked to see who really are dealing with issues of incurable diseases, and how we would want to think about the steps for the end of their life. Walking through the ICU with one of my colleagues who I actually went to college with, she felt like she was running a warehouse for the dying. The day I was walking through with her, she had 8 of her 10 patients who were there as a consequence of incurable illnesses. The one was an 80-year-old woman with an end-stage congestive heart failure who'd been in the intensive care unit twice during the last 3 weeks, this time back on the ventilator, drugged to oblivion, tubed in every orifice, and nothing that she could offer that was changing the underlying situation. Another was a woman in her 70s who had a metastatic cancer that had reached the point, which is often an end-stage sign, that she had gotten a fungal pneumonia from having her immune system so beaten down. And her plan all along had been that she would not come to an intensive care unit. Her husband had died after a long bout with a terminal illness. She did not want to go through all of the same kind of situation. But her oncologist persuaded her that maybe this pneumonia could be reversed and that this would be worth trying to fight for. All of them had illnesses that they actually had been informed were incurable. Sarah Monopoly knew her disease was incurable. But we also always say, but we do have treatments. We have things we can do to try to buy more time to improve your life. And so the result is that we all end up aware that there's our terminal conditions and yet unprepared for the moment that it might come. The research studies show that the folks who do end up in the ICU at the end of life, or on a ventilator, or with CPR because your heart is stopped at the end of life, that those people have a lower quality of life in their final few days and weeks before they die than people who do not end up getting those treatments. And also, strikingly, that their family members, when you look at them and follow up with them 6 months after someone has passed away, their family members are much more likely to have major depression and not have recovered themselves from what their family member has gone through. It's traumatic for everybody. And so the typical story becomes one where we face disease at the end of life, that we're coming to the hospital because of a problem associated with that disease, and that we're never quite sure when the end is going to come. And so we think, well, this time maybe I can come into the hospital and things will set me back on a road, maybe not quite as good as before I came in, but at least I could get that much more time. And then the next thing you know, you're too sick to even realize that you've come to the end. And so you only see the pain when you see the husband or the wife sitting at the bedside, unable to talk and communicate with this person under sedation, or simply delirious from all of what they're going through, unable to have had that last conversation, unable to say, I love you, I'm sorry, or simply reminisce and share about what's to come, because this person is not even realizing that they will not wake up again, that this is where their end will come. People have concerns that are bigger than the ones that seem to dominate the public discussion about death panels and the like. The concerns, for sure, include wanting to live a life as long as feasible, but then other things as well. Wanting to be in control if they have to face death. Wanting to be mentally aware. Not wanting to be a burden on their families. Wanting to feel that life has a kind of completeness to it, that things have been brought together. Not suffering. And what's the troubling issue for us is not the cost of the end of life and how it comes to us, but the fact that we have a health system that is so unprepared to help people with what's most important to them in their final days, final months, as we go along. Science has become the source of our difficulty, I think. We actually knew how to die for a long time. Dying was, for most of human history, a kind of brief process. There were certainly lingering conditions, tuberculosis being a long, famous one. But for the most part, people experienced illness, as a colleague put it, as bad weather, something that you either made it through or you didn't. And so George Washington got a throat infection and a day and a half later died from the consequences of the throat infection. By contrast, well, I should say a couple other things about that. The result was that we had built up a set of customs that were suited to that world, a sense of the deathbed vigil, the art of dying. Goes back to the Middle Ages with popular guidebooks that went under the title of Ars Moriendi, that would give people guidance on the kinds of ways to help people meet goals at the end of life. A lot of those goals were religious goals, helping people repent their sins, to accept the Savior. And so a lot of the questions were around trying to get people to confess last sins and to embrace God towards the end. There was great importance held in the idea of last words. One of the oddities is that we've changed to a world where brief death is rare. The catastrophic, swift kind of death is now no longer the norm. And ironically, even though we have that much more time, the idea of last words has become something that we no longer really are able to embrace. It's partly because people go through such long periods of the ways in which we pass away now are predominantly that we will come to an incurable illness. The illnesses will be conditions like, an advanced cancer is one common one. Much more commonly, it is a failure of one or another organ system, congestive heart failure, kidney failure, liver failure, or, for lack of a better term, brain failure, with encroaching dementia, making it so that you become less and less able to function. And in the midst of all this, the process is so long, we almost don't know when to have that bedside vigil, when the end might come. Our words don't even work. When we talk about the dying, I have a patient who is in her early 50s. She has a metastatic colon cancer. Is she dying? The death process for her could take anywhere from 2 to 5 years. And at any point along the way, our language has almost been rendered obsolete, and certainly our rituals are. We're put in a position of having to reinvent what it means and what our rituals should be for the end of life. We've reached the point where death is certain, but the timing is not. We're unclear on when the end might come, and we've then been left struggling with how to cope with that situation and how to do well. I knew that there was an alternative to that ICU or hospital death. I knew about hospice, that I had occasionally had patients who ended up choosing to go to hospice. Hospice I thought of as essentially a kind of morphine drip for the last couple of days. What I did not really think of it being was the nurse that I then went on a walking tour with as she went on her usual rounds during the week, seeing her panel of patients as a hospice nurse, Sarah Creed. I didn't actually give her age in the article because she was only 29, and she came across as so wise that I didn't think people would believe a 29-year-old could have been the person doing all of this. But there was much more to her than being the grim reaper of death. We went to visit one patient that I talked about named Lee Cox. She was 72 years old, and she had a previous, she had class 4 congestive heart failure, the end stage of the failure of her heart, along with an advanced case of incurable pulmonary fibrosis, where the lungs are becoming more and more fibrotic from a disease whose cause we still don't really understand, but it leads you to become less and less able to breathe as time goes on. And during the previous year, she'd had a succession of admissions to the hospital, each one worse than the last, until it reached the point where the doctors really said, you know, you might have only a couple of weeks left at this point, and you can either be here in the hospital or we can have you spend the time at home with hospice. And she chose hospice. When we visited her, she came in stringing a 20-foot line of oxygen tubing so that she could come and answer the door. She was on a friendly first-name basis with Sarah. They chit-chatted about what had been going on in the last couple of days since she last saw her. Lee confessed to Sarah that she was feeling worse in those last couple of days. She'd started to get some chest pain. Going from the bathroom to her bedroom, she would become so short of breath from that short walk that she'd have to sit and pant for 5 minutes just to see if she could get back to being stable again. She felt like the end could be coming any moment now. So what did Sarah do? She listened to her lungs. She took her blood pressure. She figured out her pulse was high. She went through her medications. She found that her heart pills had run out for the last few days, and the prescriptions hadn't been filled. She went into her bedroom and checked the oxygen canisters. They were working fine, but saw that the nebulizer machine that gave her inhaled treatments were broken. And then on the spot, she arranged for these things to be fixed. She confirmed that the pharmacy had the prescriptions available. She made sure a note was available for Lee Cox's niece to pick up the prescriptions on the way home. She called in an emergency call for the equipment supplier to come fix the inhaler, and I was sort of puzzled by this. I said, I thought the whole purpose of hospice was to let nature take its course. And she said, absolutely not. The purpose of hospice is to help people live now. Usually medical treatment is about the idea that you sacrifice time now, you sacrifice your pain, you sacrifice the quality of what you can be doing now in this moment for the sake of time later, for the sake of adding some later months or years or longer. But hospice has the different ideal that the goal is have the best possible life now. And if that means helping her with her breathing because that's making her miserable, then that's what you do. It's indifferent to whether that helps you live longer or shorter. It just asks you to live now. But what was really striking about it was we were seeing Lee now 1 year after her discharge from the hospital, where she said she had only a couple weeks left. And the effort to not worry about whether they were shortening her life or lengthening it, but instead simply to ask that day to day, she live now, that we do what we can so that her suffering be limited as much as nature and her body would let us, that she get to do the kinds of things that she might want to do. And so the previous weekend, they'd figured out a way that she could take her oxygen canisters and simply make a couple shopping trips around town and go to get her hair done, something to make her feel like a human being. And this is what they'd managed to do for the previous year. The thought that I'd always had was that the choices when you face a terminal condition are either you fight for added time or you give up. That hospice and palliative care were mostly about hastening death at the end when there simply were no longer good options. But that scene of seeing Lee Cox led me to the journal articles. And what you saw were study after study of evidence that hospice, in fact, did not shorten people's life. 4,500 Medicare patients studied, for example, comparing those who had chosen hospice for terminal cancer or terminal cardiac disease or not chosen hospice. And the comparisons showed that in any of the categories, none of those patients lived shorter by choosing hospice. In fact, the pancreatic cancer patients lived on average 3 weeks longer. The lung cancer patients, 6 weeks longer. The congestive heart failure patients, 3 months longer. Those studies have long been criticized for, how do you really know that the people who chose hospice are the same as the people who didn't choose hospice? They might have been just very different people, and simply the nature of being educated enough to choose hospice and that kind of thing might have meant that they just were doing better. But then last month, in the New England Journal came out a study from the Mass General Hospital where they took patients with end-stage lung cancer, continued having them see their oncologists, get their chemotherapy, radiation treatments, whatever they needed, but randomized them so that half, at random, could also see a palliative care physician who would focus on the questions of what you need now to have a good life now, regardless of what there is to come, and to think about, have a discussion about what you want as you draw near the end. The striking thing about the results, the patients who got those palliative care discussions ended up choosing less chemotherapy. They ended up being admitted to the hospital less. They chose not to enter the intensive care units and were much less likely to die in intensive care. They had more time at home. They had a better quality of life. But they also had a 25% longer life. And that is, in a way, a kind of indictment of our care to this point. We have made a system in which there is a kind of unstoppable momentum to simply doing something. And our struggle is against that momentum, against halting it when it reaches the point that it might actually be harming us more than it is helping us. Sarah Monopoly went from the June diagnosis of her lung cancer, swift delivery of her child, starting on the first round of chemotherapy, second round of chemotherapy through the summer, and then saw the disease progressing, moving on by the fall to her liver, to her bones and spine. And by Thanksgiving, she was having worse shortness of breath more pain, needing to be on chronic narcotics around the clock. She'd been through 3 different cycles of chemotherapy. And her oncologist sat down with her and her husband and her parents to talk through the options at that point. She wasn't in denial. She knew she was going to die. She had written out instructions for how she wanted little Vivian to be cared for after she was gone. She had voiced her concern that she did not want to die in a hospital. But neither was she or her husband or her family prepared for the idea that the moment that she would die would be any time soon. Yes, this is a terminal condition. But are we really at the point that that is anything we need to be thinking about? As her husband told me, we never discussed the idea of stopping her treatment. And so the only real discussion at that point was, what should this 4th round of chemotherapy be? Should we try for an experimental treatment? There was a drug that Pfizer had made that seemed like it might be something that would be helpful with her disease, and there was a phase 1 trial. Now, never mind that when they tested her cells in the laboratory against the drug, it didn't show any activity. Never mind that this was a phase 1 trial, meaning a trial that is just there to try different doses of the drug for whether it causes toxicity or not. But those are not definitive, and there is that little glimmer of hope and possibility that maybe it could be something of benefit. The further problem is she had had a complication during the summer where she developed blood clots in her lungs, and under the protocol she needed to be at least 6 months out from those blood clots in order to qualify for the trial. And so as an effort to get to the trial, they decided to try a 4th cycle of conventional chemotherapy. And so, step by step, she ended up back in the chemo infusion room, nauseated, sick, beaten down, trying to make it through, to hope that by February she would be able to take that 4th round or that new round with this experimental drug, the hoped-for miracle that there might be. You'd think we would be good at talking to patients about this situation because we come up against this all the time. But there are, in fact, 2 things that make us pretty bad at this as doctors, or at least not as good as we should be. Number 1 is we're not good at telling people, estimating, not telling, just estimating in our own minds how long somebody has. A study of doctors by Nicholas Christakis asking them to estimate for their terminally ill patients when they were going to die, and then watching and following along, found that that on average they were off by more than 500%. Nearly all in the over-optimistic direction. Second of all, a further study found that even this over-optimistic estimate, we're reluctant to tell patients about. So when I asked Paul Marcoux, her oncologist, what he thought would be the long tail of hope that he was really hoping to provide as a cancer oncologist for her, he said his long tail of hope would be that he could get her an extra year or 2, where the average survival for a cancer patient in her situation would be about a year. Whereas, as he said, what his patients hope and believe is that they'll get 15 or 20 years ahead of them. Now, if his thought that he might get her an extra year or 2 is over-optimistic, and he knows that they are thinking that there's many more years to come, it becomes a situation where we just don't know even how to discuss it. Or at least we tend to beat around the bush and avoid the situation. And I know this because with Sarah, I was avoiding this conversation as well. Sarah had that advanced lung cancer, and it turned out she also had a second kind of cancer. She had a thyroid cancer that had spread into the lymph nodes of her neck and become metastatic. Now, that's a curable condition, but with a big operation to take out the thyroid and to remove in a radical neck dissection all of the lymph nodes that might be involved. And so her oncologist sent her to see me to take care of this thyroid problem. And sitting with this young woman who was already suffering under chemotherapy, struggling with a metastatic lung cancer that I knew would last, would get her long before this thyroid cancer ever did. The puzzle in my mind was how to even discuss this with them. Because the good decision would be to tell her that we should not operate on her thyroid cancer. The good decision would be to say the lung cancer is going to do its worst long before this does any real damage to you. But watching her with her baby in her lap in my office, it was simply not a conversation I could bring myself to make. And so I cheated. I said, how about we see how the first goal here is, let's cure the lung cancer, and then we'll take care of the thyroid cancer, but I don't want to hold up that chemotherapy so that you get this thyroid cancer taken care of because, it's growing much more slowly than lung cancer, so we got to tackle that one. So why don't I see you every 6 weeks or so? We'll make sure the thyroid cancer is doing okay, and then if we get a window of opportunity, we'll operate on the thyroid cancer at that point. It was a cop-out. It was a way that I could keep the conversation going. So every 6 weeks, I would see her, and we talk about that. Well, maybe 6 weeks from now, that's when we'll plan the surgery. Maybe that's what we'll do. And I watched her decline from appointment to appointment until by December, she was coming in a wheelchair because she was too short of breath to walk from the parking garage to my office. It was to the point that I even, and I'm embarrassed to admit it, talked to her about the idea when she now had failed her third round of chemotherapy. I said, well, maybe, this is interesting, suppose the experimental therapy manages to treat both cancers. It was easier to have that conversation than to figure out where to start around the idea that she might want to simply halt and hold off altogether on ever trying to treat the thyroid cancer. What we've done, essentially, is we've created a multi-trillion-dollar system to dole out lottery tickets, to offer people the 1 in a million chance that something might cure their otherwise incurable disease. And it's possible. There is that person who has that rupturing aneurysm who lives a year or longer and never sees it come to bother them. But we've somehow convinced ourselves that to be willing to offer the lottery ticket means that we have to be unprepared for what is the far more likely situation, which is that your winning number doesn't come up after all. And that unwillingness, that lack of preparation, the fact that we're not yet good at being able to talk through what happens if you don't win the lottery ticket, has been the defining struggle of our system's failure to take good care of people in the final days of their life. So having failed to talk with Sarah Monopoly and her husband about what was to come, the moment did come. It came on a Friday morning in February where she woke up one day and she couldn't breathe. She was simply too short of breath, which is what happens when you have a lung cancer that's progressing. We know it. We never talk to her about it. And so what could her husband do in that moment? She had tubes at this point that were draining fluid in both sides of her chest, and so he opened the tubes hoping that letting off fluid would let her catch her breath, and she couldn't even get the sentences out. He turned the oxygen up in her oxygen tubing, and it wasn't working. And so he called 911 because this was the only option that he really had left. He watched a half dozen firemen come charging up the stairs, take her off to the hospital. He remembered it as this incredibly surreal moment. Rich was, in his heart of hearts, kind of knew this could be the end. But because every time they'd come to a crisis, they had never wanted to convince themselves that was the possibility, he hopped into the front seat of the ambulance rather than sitting in the back with Sarah. And he is horrified looking back on it to this day. He sat there having this surreal conversation with the ambulance driver about, football or baseball or something like that. And all the while he was thinking, I want to be back there with my wife. She came to the emergency room. She proved to have pneumonia, along with further spread of her disease. The plan was then to give her antibiotics in the hope that they could reverse the situation. She was taken upstairs to one of our floors. Over the next 24 hours, the pneumonia seemed to not reverse, or else it was just a worsening shortness of breath. And with the family sitting there, her sister was in town. They simply were chatting about this and that. The sister said to her, I can't find anything funny to say about this situation. And Sarah replied, neither can I. And only later did they realize that that was going to be the last words they would ever hear from her. She gradually sank into in and out of consciousness. And now the only thing that they had as an option in front of them was, do they escalate to intensive care? Do they put her on a ventilator? When we don't know when the moment is going to come, when we're unprepared for when that ever could be, our impulse is always to fight, to battle against that next thing to come. What we want, what we think, is that there will come a moment when a doctor will say to you, there's nothing we can do anymore. But the reality is there's always something we can do. We can put you on a ventilator. We can put a feeding tube in your stomach. We can put a tracheotomy in your neck. We can shock your heart if it stops. We can give an antibiotic against the encroaching infections as your immune system weakens. There's always something more that we can do. And the fact that in the effort to do more, that we may be in fact shortening your lives with the chemotherapy, with the attempted operation, doesn't ever seem to register, doesn't ever seem to be something that we're ready to struggle with. Can we change this? The dominant line of argument seems to be we should make people choose. We should make people understand that you can no longer have that ventilator, that you can't have that fourth round of chemotherapy. This doesn't go over really well. These are the cries of rationing that you hear when we start talking about the idea that we might be able to do something to improve how care for the terminally ill really goes. But there's a fascinating experiment, which is one that Aetna insurance company, of all places, decided to make, which is that they did an experiment where they offered the option of hospice and palliative care to patients under different rules than currently exist in insurance. Currently, if you want to receive hospice services, to have that nurse, Sarah Creed, coming to your house, helping you arrange for pain medication, helping you have an emergency kit available in case a moment comes where you might become too short of breath, and we can provide, your own family can provide morphine to make it so that your breathing will be more comfortable, to arrange for the steps in place so that when death comes, it can happen with everybody around at home instead of in an ambulance or at the hospital. They decided to offer, that hospice availability depends on your signing away, your choosing to give up on chemotherapy, to give up on radiation, give up any form of curative treatment. It's a decision to say, you're now ready to let go. But since most of us aren't ready at that moment, our statistics show that a minority of Americans ever choose hospice at the end, and it's predominantly people choosing only in the final few days of life, at the very, very end, when there's little that can be done to help alleviate, prepare for that end. Aetna decided to offer the option without having to choose. They called it concurrent care. As soon as you had diagnosis of an incurable condition, you could receive hospice services at home and continue to get your chemotherapy, continue to have the option of surgery, going to the emergency room. The result was that instead of less than 30% of their enrollees who had a terminal condition choosing hospice, greater than 70% chose it. And why not? It's free services or minimal cost, and you'd have that available. But the striking thing was that those people then chose themselves to not enter the hospital. They chose themselves to be prepared and not end up in the ICU at the end of life. Their costs ended up lower, but their quality of life ended up higher. In the Coping with Cancer study, which was done in 7 cancer centers around the country, probably the most striking finding to me was that in this study of patients with advanced cancer, the average patient at the time that they entered the study was had only 4 months of life left. And yet, only 1/3 of the patients had any discussion with their doctor about their goals for the end of life, what their needs might be to alleviate suffering as the end came. 2/3 didn't. But the 1/3 that did were less likely to end up in the hospital, less likely to end up in the ICU, had a better quality of life in their final weeks before the end, and their relatives 6 months later had a much lower incidence of depression and trauma, the signs of post-traumatic stress that we see. All from just simple discussions, simply having the option to work your way through thinking through these kinds of issues. These are hard conversations. I've blown them many times myself. I've not known what to do. And with this study coming out from the Mass General where the patients had seen a palliative care physician, I realized that the gain they'd gotten was that really they'd seen 6 people who knew how to, that's the staff at the Mass General for palliative care, that they'd seen one of these 6 people who knew how to talk to them about the end of life. And so what I did was I went to those doctors and just said, I'm really bad at this. If you had to make a little list for me of what it is that I should talk about with people facing these problems, what would you put on that list? One of the doctors that I spoke to was a palliative care physician at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute named Susan Block. And Susan encapsulated it, I thought, the best for me, at least in a way that I could use. She said that there were 4 things that she has as a little mental list in her head that she wants to talk about with a patient who's terminally ill. Number 1, do they know their prognosis? Number 2, What are their fears about what is to come? Number 3, what are their goals? What would they like to do as time runs short? And 4th, what are the trade-offs they're willing to make? How much suffering are they willing to go through for the sake of the possibility of added time? That list was really interesting to me. It was not a list asking, do you want a ventilator or do you not want a ventilator as you come to the end? Do you want your heart shocked? Do you not want your heart shocked? Her point was, if you tell me the answers to those questions, I can make a recommendation to you that says, you would not want this toward the end if these are your goals. Our misconception is that the conversation is about hard choices. Really, it's a conversation about asking people about what they want to look forward to as time runs short and what they fear the most. And the second misconception is that that arriving at what we want at the end is a kind of epiphany. Sign here. Do you want hospice? Do you not want hospice? It's not an epiphany. It's a process. It's a series of conversations and ups and downs as we go through a very hard series of sequence of things that happen to you as you become ill and have things come to an end. Susan told me the story of seeing her dad, who had a tumor in his spinal cord, come to face a operation that had a 20% risk it would leave him quadriplegic. The tumor in his spinal cord was high in his neck at a level where you would be quadriplegic if things went awry. And she was his healthcare proxy if he no longer could make decisions for himself. And she'd flown out to see him in San Francisco where he was. They sat at the bedside the night before the surgery, and they mostly avoided talking about surgery. They talked about friends and they talked about family. And then she left and she realized, here I am, the palliative care specialist, and I couldn't have this conversation with my dad. She was halfway across the Bay Bridge and turned her car around and went back. And she went back in and she said, Dad, there's a really hard conversation we need to have. And he went through that list with him. What is he worried about what lies ahead? And he asked him especially, if anything terrible should happen, how much suffering are you willing to go through for the sake of simply added time? What if something really went awry and you were to become quadriplegic? And he had an interesting answer. He said, he said, I'm a tough guy. I can endure a lot of pain. That doesn't trouble me. I'm willing to have a diminished life for the sake of having a longer life, as long as I can eat chocolate ice cream and watch football on television. And she was flabbergasted by this. He's an emeritus professor of psychology at Berkeley. She'd never seen him watch a football game in her life. But the next day when he went through the operation, he came out initially doing well and then had bleeding, which left him with encroaching quadriplegia. The surgeon then came to her to make the decision. Should we take him back to the operating room or not? And try to stop the bleeding, when the reality is at this point he's going to come out quadriplegic no matter what they do. And she realized that she had the answer already. She asked the surgeon, would he be able to eat ice cream and watch football on television? Yes. And so she signed to have him go to surgery. If she hadn't had that conversation, almost any answer she would have given would have racked her for the rest of her life. If she had said no and died, she would never have been sure she was doing the right thing. And if she said yes, and then saw what he did go through, which was more than a year of horrendous rehab in facilities, initially wheelchair-bound, gradually able to begin walking a little bit, getting just enough hand use to begin doing a little bit of writing. She would have thought that she had made the terrible decision for him. But over 2 years, he recovered enough ability that he actually wrote 10 more articles in psychology and another book. And then 7, 8 years later, reached the point where he was so weakened that he now no longer was able to eat. And the decision came, would he want a feeding tube as the only way he'd be able to be alive and nourished? And he said no. They brought him home with hospice. 5 days later, without food and water, as he'd chosen, with his family around him, he passed away peacefully. And everyone felt it was right. There's a concept in Sweden they call the Breakpoint discussion. It's the discussion that you have where you ask those questions. Not when crisis has come. It's too late when people are in the intensive care unit in the emergency room. And not the day you get diagnosed with a terminal illness. But in between, that moment when the chemotherapy, that first round of chemotherapy is no longer working, or your congestive heart failure has reached the point that you need oxygen at home. And then it's to begin to ask those hard questions about what you have as your fears for the future, your goals if time gets short, the trade-offs one is willing to make. Sarah Monopoly had a primary care physician who'd been following along and had left the decision-making to the oncologists. But seeing her come into the emergency room with this pneumonia, he decided to intervene at that point. And he said to the family, it's possible that this pneumonia can be reversed, but there's nothing about her cancer that's changing here. And I think it's very possible that we might be here at the end. He asked them to go ahead and gather the family and bring them so they'd have that chance. If they were wrong, they'd all dance in the office. But that simple opening the door led them to realize 48 hours later, as she's passing in and out of consciousness, that this was more suffering than she ought to be going through. He was able to persuade them to allow her to receive some morphine. And they watched her breathing, which had been agonizing and took all of her energy, suddenly no longer be the kind of struggle that it was. She simply slept comfortably. And at that point, something switched, and they just didn't want any suffering for her anymore. Her mother went to the chief nurse and said, no more blood sticks, no more middle-of-the-night blood pressures. I don't give a damn about your record keeping. And about a day after that, she passed away. There was a underlying further context to this that I didn't mention in writing about it, which is that my father is going through the same sorts of issues himself. He, in fact, had the same kind of tumor in his spinal cord that Jack Block had. It's growing at the base of his brainstem, and it's not curable. Unlike Jack Block's, his cannot be removed. It goes up too high. But he had an option as his left arm became paralyzed. My dad's a surgeon, and he had to quit his practice in surgery about 1.5 years ago when his left arm became paralyzed. He actually operated for 6 months longer with his left arm paralyzed. He said, "Oh, the nurses don't even notice." Like, they notice. And thank goodness he didn't hurt anybody before he finally did put down the scalpel. I sat with him before his operation in my living room and went through those list of questions with him. And it was very hard, but it was completely transformative. And I found that again and again with patients since writing about this idea. Initially, we didn't know how to talk about this incurable tumor he has. We mostly were focused on there's surgery, there's radiation, and we have had all of that planned. We went through the questions, though, and I asked him, what are his fears about what lies ahead? What are his goals as this gets worse? And how much suffering is he willing to go through? And he was very interesting about this. He was very clear. He did not think eating chocolate ice cream and watching football on television was enough life for him. He's a social person. He's a surgeon. He's used to being in control. He did not want to end his life with a long period of having no control. Imagining being quadriplegic, and at the level of his tumor, it would mean being in a kind of Christopher Reeve situation, being on a ventilator with a feeding tube. That for him is not the kind of life that he wants for his remaining days. And so I understood coming out of that if things went wrong during his operation, that he did not want to be woken up again, that he would not want all of those measures brought in. He did fabulously. He had his operation back home in Ohio. Within 3 days, he was sitting up in bed eating cornflakes. 8 days later, he was home. He's now undergoing his radiation therapy. The radiation therapy has been a real struggle. It's weakened him. He's day to day, at times feeling like maybe he should stop. But we only have now about 10 days left in his radiation cycle, and then he'll be done. And what is different coming out of it is I know exactly now what he wants, and I understand better how he can avoid having an end in the way that he does not want as it comes. Doesn't mean any of it's going to be easier. Doesn't mean his doctors are easy to deal with. Doesn't mean they're necessarily on the same page. But we are. And that's going to make all the difference. As we embark in the next few years on this effort to reform healthcare, I think this is going to be one of our crucial issues. And the fundamental thing that I wanted to do in trying to write about these issues is just create space to have this discussion again. Create space that that we could rise above the demonization of the idea that discussions of what we might want at the end of our own lives is a discussion about pulling the plug on grandma. It's much deeper than that. It's a discussion about how we want to live when we all know we're going to die. Thank you. We have time for questions, and there'll be 2 microphone stands in the aisle, so you're welcome to come on up to a microphone and ask your question.
I was wondering how the option to choose death affects that conversation. I have family in Oregon and who have a close friend who made that choice with a very positive outcome, and I've wondered what effect that has on the conversation.
So Oregon and Washington State now, just recently Washington State became the second state to allow assisted suicide, where a physician can prescribe medication to allow people to end their own lives if there's certification that there's not depression and that they're really terminally ill. And I'm instinctively against that. Having spent my last 10 years or more studying all the ways in which we make mistakes in medicine, I've come away with the recognition that almost anything we set out to do, there's a substantial likelihood that we have basic errors. So if you take a patient with coronary artery disease, we have a 40% chance that in our communities, physicians are providing incomplete or inappropriate care. asthma, it's closer to 50%. And so if we have difficulty making sure that basic kinds of measures are followed for conditions like those where we can help extend people's lives, I have great concerns that being able to provide means of dying, provide assisted suicide for people, will just make lots of mistakes. We saw that with Jack Kevorkian with a couple of patients that proved not to have, in fact, terminal illness in their autopsy findings. And so, on the one hand, I think having people have the option of having more control over the situation is the humane thing to do. It is an indictment of our healthcare that people who are facing terminal illness feel that there is no other option than simply to end their own life because we are unable to provide good support and symptom relief and so on when that knowledge is available. And so I'm troubled mostly by that component. And I fear it would lead people to not trust when they come to see physicians that we really are doing all we can to serve their needs and wants for a longer life. If that's what people want to fight for as their primary goal, there will be people who will say, no matter what, all the way to the end, put me in that intensive care unit, put me on the ventilator. If I have the slightest sliver of chance, I don't want to miss out on that. And even if it's just my body being alive, that's something that I care about. I think we have to be able to offer options in such a way that people do not fear we're taking those away from them. So I remain skeptical, watching very closely in Oregon and Washington, and worried about mistakes. Let's go over here.
Thanks very much. That was great. You talk about science as being part of the problem, but I think there's also something about American culture that makes us have this can-do sense. And I'm curious also role of religion. So, I mean, in my own mind, I think that perhaps in the days of yore, when people believed there was an afterlife widely, and that when they died, they'd go on to something, heaven, et cetera, that as Americans, I think, move away from that. I think that's part of what makes us grasp these other things. And also, I wonder if you can just talk a little bit, I'm just curious your thoughts about that, and then perhaps a little bit about, curious about your thoughts about writing, how you sort of balance time to sort of write and do all these other things, et cetera.
I'll try that one. So, I very commonly hear from my colleagues, they're saying, the patients want everything. What am I supposed to do? This is America. People don't want to hear that there's nothing we can do. And my answer to that is, I think that's human nature. This is human beings. I talk to my colleagues in Europe and in India, and it turns out people there all want to live forever too. And they struggle just as much with the same kind of question. And it feels to me like our job is to deal with human nature as it is. And human nature is people who want to live in denial. That coping with denial is part of our job as physicians, and getting good at being able to deal with it is partly what palliative care physicians have learned to do, are learning to do. And that we just we mostly have surrounded ourselves with lore about it rather than really being systematic about it. What is the process of series of discussions with people that, doesn't reverse their denial but helps them cope with what is coming along? Mostly dealing with terminal illness is a huge layer of coping with anxiety about what's to come, everything from finances to family stress to the medical decisions that have to be made. And I think that we could get much, much better at being able to handle those situations, and that putting it onto the patients as being until patients change, there's nothing we can do. I don't think that that's true, actually. I think that we in the profession can get better at helping these situations. And I also think in the community, that list of questions that Susan Block goes through with her with her patients, is one that any family can go through with a family member who's reached that stage of illness, Grandpa, what are you afraid of as things get worse? What are your goals as time goes on here? What's your bucket list? And that can begin to overcome and take away some of the fear that drives that same denial. The writing life. I never thought writing would be a significant part of my life. I didn't start writing until I was partway through my surgical training, when a friend of mine who was then just starting up Slate magazine, and in 1998 there was no one was reading, or 1996, no one was reading anything on their computers. No one was reading internet magazines, so no one would write for him. And so he begged his friends to try to write. And so I started just doing short little columns for him because it was fun. I was terrible at it, and he just was really great at telling me what to do better. This sucks, Atul. Do this, don't do that. And as time went on, I just found it becoming more and more a part of my life, but never really fitting in a certain way. I still haven't found a way to make it something that's consistent, something more than nights and weekends and random days here and there. I can go 2 weeks, feeling extremely guilty about not getting another page written, and feeling like this is, to me now, one of the most important thing I do. If I died tomorrow, my patients lined up for next week wouldn't even get their operation delayed. Someone else will step in and help take care of it. Our research studies might be set back maybe 6 months, and then someone else will come in and take care of that. But I feel like the writing is the one thing that I do that would, at least in the way that I'm going about it, would go away. And so I make time for it. I steal time from my children, from my wife, from work. But eventually I hope to find a way to make it a real part of day-to-day life. But at the same time, the medicine, the effort to try to do research and so on is also the vantage point from which I can see what's happening. And so that's sort of inseparable.
Thanks very much.
Yes?
Hi. I'm just wondering, with this day and age, there's chronic illness, you have multiple providers, and you were talking about how, you were pawning off having the discussion to almost the oncologist when this person had several providers. And I'm just wondering who you think, whose responsibility it is to have these end-of-life discussions, because as a nursing student, we're taught to have them as a primary care provider before you even become ill with a disease.
Yeah, it reminded me of when I went to, I visited bear with me for this analogy, I visited a skyscraper construction site. And there were 500, I asked the foreman on duty that day, he said there were 500 workers on site from 60 different subcontractors. And, when you see each of them, you realize they're all just subspecialists. The elevator guy doesn't give a damn about what the structural beam guy is doing, and the structural beam guy doesn't care about what the green team is doing. And in the middle of it all, you could have a building that just never, ever really came together and became anything. And there was a person that sat in the middle of it that is their project manager, whose role is, in a really complex job of a skyscraper going up, making sure all the pieces fit together. And we don't have that in medicine. Who is really going to play that role? In theory, it's your primary care physician, your internist, your family physician. But they aren't even all that equipped to be able to take that overview. When I talked to Chuck Morris, who's the internist for Sarah Monopoly, and asked him, why were you not stepping in and helping them through the decisions about should you do chemotherapy, that second round, the third round? And its answer was partly, well, I don't even know when the crises were happening and they were going to the next stage. It's sort of all in the oncologist's hands. But second of all, he was uncomfortable with, do I know how to make this decision around this chemotherapy versus that chemotherapy? It's not on the tips of my fingers, being able to do that. And yet he feels he's one of the best internists I know. He feels like this is his responsibility. He has to have a way to handle these kinds of situations better. So my sense is we're struggling with this. that we have people going through complex illness. If you have a cancer, you're going to have a radiation therapist, a nutritionist, a social worker, a nurse practitioner, the oncologist, your internist, and none of them coming together to really be your team. And this is true not just in cancer, but in multiple other areas. And I think we're just learning what it looks like. People call it the medical home these days. A medical home is the idea that your internist is more than just your visits with them, that they are actually paid to email with you, to have give you their cell phone number, or have a backup person who handles that cell phone set of conversations, that they actually talk to, not just get notes from, but talk to the specialist taking care of you and help pull the whole team together. Because what Chuck really could do is get on the phone with Paul, the oncologist, and say, well, here's what Sarah has as her real goals here. Can you tell me, are the options with chemotherapy you're offering really doing that or not? And helping pull it together. It could be a nurse who plays this role and begins to knit this work together. One of the things that struck me on the construction site was the project manager was not an architect. He was not an engineer. He was not a construction worker. He had a bachelor's level education, but he was really good at making sure that everybody talked together who had expertise to make sure this building could go up and be as good as it could possibly be. And we may yet find we need to create that ourselves in our line of work. Yes?
I'm an oncologist, if I may. I would like to make a couple of comments.
Yeah.
First of all, I thank you for bringing an important subject that we don't talk enough about, and it's about time. Thank you so much for doing that. When one listens to you managing the various patients you dealt with, I think you were the most successful with your aortic aneurysm patient, the first one.
It's true.
Clearly.
It's true.
Okay?
I did nothing.
You did a lot. What you did is listen. And you listened with an expert ear, because this is a field where you feel so comfortable that you could call the shot and agree with the patient who refused to be treated. And you were very happy about your decision. You did the right thing for her. With the others, you were always uncomfortable because you were not the expert. With Sarah Monopoly, you had lung cancer, a baby, and thyroid cancer. You're not the cancer expert. The oncologist dumped on you what he didn't have the guts to take care of. And that's the problem.
Yeah.
So
it goes back to what she was raising earlier. The oncologist, and you experience this, you have hope. Your pride in what you do is that you can find the right solutions for people. But developing a certain pride about also knowing when to help people come to that phase of letting go. I compared it to being a general in a war where you know you will lose eventually. And if we're a culture of General Custers who fight to the point of total annihilation, we will lose again and again and again. Whereas the Robert E. Lee, who understands that you fight and fight and fight for the territory that you can get, but you also know when it's time to surrender. That is the difficult place for us to come to. But we're starting to see the kinds of questions and experiences that can get us there.
But I think in any illness, especially in cancer, I would say, it's a journey. And the oncologist is supposed and should be the coach. He should be coaching his patient and his family on how to go through that journey. He knows better than anybody else, but he doesn't have the guts to say the truth. Yeah. And during that whole lecture, I would say there was an elephant in the room, which sometimes you named and sometimes you went around, which is the truth. And I would like to really vote for the power of the truth, which is without it, we continue fooling around, beating around the bush, making decisions, giving wrong choices. So many times we give choices that are not real choices to patients, only because we never had the guts to say the truth from day one. And if we call the shots with the truth lined up, then we can coach our patients during that journey and get them peacefully to where they should be.
Well, I'm so glad you bring this up. The process of getting people there is, I tell the story of a Swedish oncologist who had a patient who was 29 years old with a metastatic brain tumor that was coming to his end phase, He had had whole brain radiation. He'd had 2 rounds of chemotherapy. And now a 3rd round of chemotherapy in situations, there's 0 evidence it adds any value in life. But when she talked the patient through the possibility of deciding not to do that 3rd round of chemotherapy, he was willing to embrace it. And then the rest of the family members came into the scene, and his father just was appalled at the idea that they would give up, went to the internet, found multiple trials, came in with a sheaf of papers, and said, how can it be that there's nothing to be done for my son? There has to be something done for my son. And the process of walking them through what she called the breakpoint discussion, walking them through the decision, was one that involved hours. She took the sheaf of paper, went through every study, and helped them understand the ways in which those studies, none of them were designed for his illness or were likely to help. And then finally could reach the point where she could say to the father, he's going to die. And at this point, he needs you to help him. He needs you to help him travel those final few months here, final few weeks. And then, only then, did they make that turn, make that switch. I think we're all, as physicians, very few of us are comfortable with that confrontation, the charged emotion in the room, the anger being directed at you for saying what you're saying. We're not entirely comfortable with the reality that once in a while there is a miracle that happens, and leaving the room open for that miracle. And we're not entirely comfortable with being able to talk about, to spend the time that it takes to talk through, because we're not paid for it. And it's easy enough to just say, you know how easy this is to just sign them up for that 4th round of chemotherapy where we're paid for it anyway? That all of those work against us. I'm afraid we're running out of time, so let me make this the last question.
Hi, my name is
And I
Emily.
apologize to the rest of you.
I just wanted to echo and say thank you for bringing up these discussions, because I think it really empowers both patients and families to give their family members and patients a very good quality of life as things become towards the end. I read your recent article where you were talking about Miss Monopoly and some of the other patients, and while reading it, I was crying not only for what they went through, but because my husband recently died 6 months ago, and we had a very different situation when it was the day in March 2008 where we sat in front of our oncologist, and he said to us, we asked him how much more time do most patients have to live, and he was honest with us. He said 2 years. And we were pregnant at that time, and we walked out the door and we said, you know what? If we get 2 years, we're lucky. And if we get more, we're incredibly lucky. And we lived every day passionately. And when it came to the point of time where we recognized that there was nothing left to do, we were okay with that. And we had had the opportunity, thankfully, to talk about everything, to talk about how we wanted to die, how he wanted to die, how we wanted to raise our son. We were able to lie down next to each other and say, thank you for giving me a wonderful marriage. And I think for me, when going to the funeral home later, I had nothing left to say. I have no regrets. And I wish that for every family that has to experience losing a loved one, because to have no regrets and to feel that you were empowered and that you made the best decisions and had the best quality of life is an incredible gift after losing someone that you care about. And I think that the fact that you're writing these articles and bringing it to the attention of the public, I wish that for everybody. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you. I can't think of a better way to end. So thank you.